Sleepless historian Salavora. Tonight's story begins on a forgotten island in the North Atlantic, where a lighthouse keeper named Elias Granger spent his winters alone with the sea, the wind, and a bell that no one could explain. The island of Blackmere was little more than a jagged rock surrounded by reefs, a place sailors avoided unless they had no other choice. In summer it was merely isolated, but in winter it became a world of darkness, salt, and storms. The lighthouse stood on the highest cliff, its beams sweeping across the water every night, guiding ships away from the deadly rocks below. Elias had served there for 4 years. He was known as a careful man, a widower who kept precise records and trusted facts more than superstition. On the evening of November 3rd, 1871, Elias climbed the spiral staircase to light the great lamp. Halfway up, he heard the lighthouse bell ring below him. The bell was used only when a supply boat approached through fog, and the rope that controlled it hung beside the entrance. Elias stopped and listened. One toll echoed through the tower, then another, then another. He looked down through the center of the staircase. The rope was perfectly still. When the ringing ended, he searched every room of the lighthouse and found no one. 3 days later, 6 fishing boats from the harbor of Dunwall vanished during a sudden storm. 32 men were lost. When the news reached Blackmere, Elias opened his journal and wrote a single sentence. The bell rang before the sea took them. He told no one, convinced that the timing was only a coincidence. 2 weeks later the bell rang again, for slow tolls that echoed through the stone tower just before midnight. 2 days after that, a cargo brig struck the northern reef and broke apart before dawn. Elias added another entry to his journal. When the bell sounded again on December 2nd, 3 tolls in the darkness, a warehouse fire destroyed much of the Dunwall waterfront 3 days later. By Christmas, the lighthouse keeper had stopped dismissing the pattern. The only person who visited the island regularly was a young sailor named Thomas Vale, who brought food, lamp oil, and mail every 10 days. During one visit, Thomas noticed the growing stack of journal pages beside Elias's desk. Curious, he read them and laughed uneasily. "You expect me to believe a bell predicts disasters?" he asked. Elias answered quietly, "I only know it rings before something terrible happens." That night the bell rang while Thomas was still on the island. 6 tolls sounded through the tower. Both men rushed downstairs and found the rope motionless. Thomas ran outside with a lantern, searching the cliff path and the shoreline, but there was no visitor, no boat, and no explanation. 2 days later, a bridge near the town of Calder collapsed during a storm, killing 17 people. As winter deepened, Blackmere became trapped by ice and violent seas. On January 9th, the bell rang 11 times, not slowly but rapidly, as if struck by a desperate hand. Elias and Thomas counted every toll. Nothing happened that night, and by morning Thomas began to believe the strange warning had failed. Then, just after sunset, a monstrous storm appeared on the horizon. Before midnight, the Atlantic erupted against the cliffs, and through the roar of wind, they heard a ship's whistle dangerously close to shore. Elias climbed to the lantern room and saw a passenger steamer drifting toward the northern reef with failed engines. Thomas fired a red flare into the storm while Elias kept the lighthouse beam fixed on the vessel. For 20 agonizing minutes, the ship fought the current before a towering wave slammed it sideways into the rocks. The sound of the impact carried through the storm. Wood shattered, metal screamed, and passengers were thrown into the black water. Using a rescue line from the cliff path, Elias and Thomas managed to pull 3 survivors to safety before the wreck disappeared beneath the waves. The next day, Thomas found a rusted brass plaque buried in snow near the lighthouse entrance. The inscription honored a former keeper named Nathaniel Reed, who had remained at his post during the Great Gale of 1824. Beneath the main text, nearly erased by corrosion, were the words, "May future keepers hear what the sea remembers." Disturbed by the discovery, Elias searched the lighthouse archives and found a bundle of papers written by Reed himself. One entry described a bell that rang before the Great Storm of 1824, warning of disaster, while harbor officials mocked him. The final page ended with a chilling line, "The bell rings again. I fear it does not warn us of weather alone." Records showed that Nathaniel Reed had died 6 days later. His body had been found at the base of the bell. On January 17th, the bell rang only once. 2 days later, a telegram arrived from Dunwall announcing that the harbor master had been found dead in his office. There were no signs of illness or violence. Elias stared at the message and realized that the number of tolls might represent the number of lives that would be lost. 2 tolls preceded a landslide that killed 2 quarry workers. 4 tolls came before 4 sailors died aboard a burning repair ship. 3 tolls warned of a carriage accident that killed 3 travelers on the coastal road. Then, on the night of February 23rd, the bell rang 32 times. Elias counted every toll with growing horror. 32 was the same number of fishermen lost months earlier. But that tragedy had already happened. Confused, he returned to Nathaniel Reed's journal and found a passage he had overlooked. Sometimes the bell mourns what the sea has claimed. Sometimes it warns what it has not yet taken. A keeper must learn the difference, though I never could. Outside the lighthouse, the Atlantic rolled beneath a moonless sky. Elias closed the journal and looked toward the staircase where the unseen bell hung above him. For the first time, he wondered whether the bell was predicting the future at all, or remembering deaths that had not finished happening yet. The wind grew colder after the 32 tolls, and Blackmere felt less like an island and more like a place waiting for something to arrive. Elias stopped trying to explain the bell. He simply recorded it. Each entry in the journal became shorter, as if words themselves had become unreliable. On February 27th, the bell rang twice. No storm followed. No telegram arrived. For 3 days nothing happened, and Thomas allowed himself to believe the pattern had finally broken. Then, just before dawn on March 1st, a small boat appeared beneath the cliffs carrying 2 exhausted fishermen. They had survived the loss of the Dunwall fleet months earlier, washed onto a distant stretch of coast, and rescued by another vessel. They had come to Blackmere with a strange request. "We heard the bell rang 32 times," one of them said, his face pale from cold and fear. Elias nodded. The older fisherman removed his cap. "There were only 30 men aboard the 6 boats," he whispered. "Not 32. Thomas frowned. "The harbor records say 32. "The harbor records were wrong," the man replied. "2 of us survived." Silence filled the room. The bell had not been mourning the dead. It had been counting everyone who had been taken by the sea, whether they lived or died. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. If the bell counted those claimed by the sea rather than those killed by it, then every toll carried a different meaning. That night, he reopened Nathaniel Reed's papers and searched for any mention of survivors. Near the back of the bundle, he found a water-stained page he had ignored before. The ink was faded, but one sentence remained legible. "The sea marks them before it chooses what to return." On March 3rd, the bell rang 5 times. Thomas wanted to send a warning to Dunwall, but Elias hesitated. 5 people, 5 sailors, 5 passengers. The bell no longer gave clear answers. 2 days later, a supply ship failed to arrive at the mainland harbor. It carried 5 crewmen. None were found. By now the story of Blackmere had spread far beyond the coast. Some captains altered their routes to avoid the island entirely. Others sailed past deliberately, hoping to hear the bell and learn their fate. The lighthouse became a place of whispered prayers and nervous glances. Then a stranger arrived. He came aboard a government cutter on March 8th, wearing a dark wool coat and carrying a leather case. He introduced himself as Dr. Samuel Whitlock, a scholar from Edinburgh studying maritime folklore. "I've heard remarkable claims about this lighthouse," he said with a polite smile. Thomas muttered, "Another man come to laugh at us." Whitlock did not laugh. He asked to see the journals. For hours he read in silence, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. When he finished, he looked at Elias with unusual seriousness. "Do you know how old this tower is?" "Built in 1819, Elias answered. Whitlock shook his head. "The lighthouse was built then. The foundation beneath it is much older." He opened his leather case and produced a charcoal rubbing of a stone carving. "I found this in an archive in Orkney," he said. "It was copied from a ruin that no longer exists. The inscription mentions a watchtower on an island called Blackmere." Elias examined the rubbing. At the center was a bell. Below it, in Latin, were words Whitlock translated quietly. "When the deep remembers, the bell will speak." Thomas stared at him. What does that mean? Whitlock closed the case. I don't know, but the carving was recorded in the 17th century, long before your lighthouse was built. That evening the three men sat beside the stove while snow drifted against the windows. Whitlock asked a question that neither Elias nor Thomas had considered. Has the bell ever rung for someone on this island? Elias opened his mouth, then stopped. No. Every toll had warned of events elsewhere. Ships, bridges, fires, roads, towns. Never Blackmere itself. As midnight approached, Whitlock stood and stretched. If your bell truly predicts disaster, perhaps tonight will be quiet. The words had barely left his mouth when the tower trembled. One toll rang through the stone, then another, then a third. The sound was deeper than before, resonating through the floorboards. Elias felt his stomach tighten. Whitlock counted under his breath. 4, 5, 6. The bell stopped. Outside, the sea was calm. Thomas forced a nervous laugh. 6 more sailors somewhere. But Whitlock was staring at the ceiling. No, he said softly. Listen. At first Elias heard nothing except the wind. Then, from far below the lighthouse, beneath the cliffs and the pounding surf, came another sound. A bell answering from underground. For several seconds none of them moved. The answering bell rose from beneath the island itself, muffled by stone and sea, yet unmistakable. It sounded once, then faded into the roar of the surf. Thomas grabbed a lantern. There's no bell under this island. There is now, Whitlock replied. Elias took the lantern from him and opened the door. The night air struck like ice. They followed the narrow path around the lighthouse while waves exploded against the cliffs below. The sound did not return. Near the northern side of the tower, Whitlock stopped beside a patch of exposed rock where the storm had washed away snow. A narrow crack ran through the stone. Was this here before? He asked. Elias crouched and examined it. Not like this. The crack was fresh. Whitlock held the lantern closer. Cold air drifted upward from the opening, carrying the smell of salt and something older, damp and mineral, like a sealed cellar that had been opened after centuries. Thomas knelt beside it. It goes down. They widened the gap with a crowbar from the tool shed. After several minutes, a section of loose rock shifted away, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness. Elias felt a strange certainty settle over him. The bell had rung 6 times. Not for sailors. Not for a distant town. For them. Whitlock lit a second lantern. If we're going in, we go together. The passage was steep and uneven. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the air grew colder with every step. After 20 yards, the tunnel opened into a chamber carved directly into the bedrock. In the center stood a bell. It was smaller than the lighthouse bell, but made of dark bronze streaked with green corrosion. Ancient symbols circled its rim. A broken rope hung beside it. Thomas stared in disbelief. How could this be here? Whitlock approached slowly. This predates the lighthouse by centuries. Elias lifted his lantern higher. The walls were covered with faded carvings of waves, ships, and human figures standing beneath the tower. At the far end of the chamber was a stone slab covered in Latin. Whitlock brushed away moisture and translated aloud. The sea keeps count. When the number is spoken above, the number is answered below. Those who hear both bells become witnesses. Witnesses to what? Thomas asked. Before Whitlock could answer, the underground bell moved. No hand touched it. It swung once and gave a low, mournful toll that vibrated through the chamber. Elias felt the sound in his chest. Then came a second toll, and a third. All 3 men looked at one another. 6 tolls above, 3 below. Whitlock turned back to the inscription, searching for another line. Near the bottom, almost hidden by erosion, he found one. The answer is always half, for the sea returns what it can. Thomas's face drained of color. 6 claimed. 3 returned. At that moment, a distant shout echoed down the tunnel. They rushed back toward the entrance and emerged onto the cliff path. A lantern bobbed near the shoreline below. A small rescue boat had reached Blackmere. Elias and Thomas scrambled down the path, while Whitlock followed. The boat's captain was soaked and exhausted. Supply ship wrecked east of here, he gasped. 6 men went overboard. Elias felt his pulse hammering. How many survived? The captain looked up. 3. We're still searching for the others. Thomas gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. The bell above had counted the 6 taken by the sea. The bell below had counted the 3 returned. Whitlock said nothing as they climbed back toward the lighthouse. His scholarly curiosity had vanished, replaced by something close to fear. Inside the keeper's quarters, Elias opened his journal with trembling hands and wrote, "March 8th. The island answered." He paused, then added another line. "The sea is not predicting events. It is keeping a ledger." Outside, the lighthouse beams swept across the black Atlantic. And somewhere beneath the stone, hidden in the darkness below Blackmere, the ancient bell waited for the next number. The discovery of the underground chamber changed everything. Until that night, Elias had believed the bell was a warning. Now he understood it was part of something older and far stranger. The sea was counting, and Blackmere was the place where the count was recorded. For the next week, no tolls sounded. The silence should have brought relief, but instead it made the lighthouse feel tense, as if the island itself were listening. Whitlock spent his days studying the chamber beneath the tower, copying symbols and inscriptions into his notebook. Thomas avoided going below unless Elias accompanied him. On March 16th, Whitlock emerged from the tunnel carrying a fragment of broken stone. "I found this near the back wall," he said. Carved into the fragment was a date, 1612. Elias stared at it. "That's 2 centuries before the lighthouse." Whitlock nodded. Whatever stood here before the tower was already watching the sea. That evening the bell above rang once. A single deep toll. The underground bell remained silent. One claimed, Thomas whispered. Or one marked. Whitlock corrected. None of them slept much. Near dawn a knock rattled the lighthouse door. A coastal patrolman stood outside, drenched from rain. "A fisherman was pulled from the water near Calder," he said. "Alive, but barely. He keeps asking for the keeper of Blackmere." They brought the man inside. His lips were blue with cold, and his hands shook violently around the mug of broth Thomas gave him. When he finally looked at Elias, terror filled his eyes. "I heard the bell," he whispered. Elias leaned forward. "Where?" "Under the water." The room fell silent. The fisherman explained that his boat had capsized during the night. As he sank, he heard a bell toll somewhere in the darkness below him. Then a wave had thrown him toward shore. "How many tolls?" Whitlock asked. "1." Thomas slowly sat down. The bell had rung once above. 1 man had been taken by the sea. 1 man had been returned. Yet the underground bell had not answered. Whitlock opened his notebook and turned several pages. "The inscription said the answer is always half," he murmured. "But 1 cannot be divided." Elias looked toward the staircase. "Unless the count isn't finished." Before anyone could respond, the lighthouse bell rang again. 1 toll, then another. The fisherman dropped his mug. Broth splashed across the floorboards. Far below them, the ancient bell answered once. Whitlock's face went pale. 2 taken, he said quietly. 1 returned. Hours later, a second body washed ashore near Calder. The dead fisherman had been the missing partner of the man sitting beside their fire. By evening, word spread through the coast that Blackmere had spoken before the sea delivered its verdict. Sailors began calling the island the keeper's ledger. Whitlock should have left then. Instead, he became obsessed. He spent hours comparing the numbers in Elias's journal with shipping records from Dunwall. On the 3rd night, he spread dozens of pages across the table. "Look," he said. Elias studied the columns. Every toll matched a maritime incident somewhere along the coast. Some involved deaths. Others involved survivors. The bell counted all of them. Then Whitlock pointed to a date from the previous year. August 14th. "Your journal records 8 tolls." Elias nodded. "A schooner wrecked south of Calder." Whitlock slid another paper forward. "The official report lists 9 people aboard." Elias frowned. Then the bell was wrong. Whitlock shook his head. "No. 1 passenger disappeared before the wreck. He was never found, and investigators assumed he had fallen overboard earlier that day." Thomas looked up sharply, meaning the sea had already counted him. Whitlock tapped the paper. "The bell only counts those claimed while the ledger is open." "What opens it?" Elias asked. Whitlock did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and removed the charcoal rubbing of the ancient carving. At the bottom, beneath the bell symbol, was a line he had not translated before. "When the witness dies, the ledger passes." A cold silence settled over the room. Elias read the sentence twice. You think Nathaniel Reed became a witness? Whitlock nodded. And after his death, the ledger passed to the next keeper. Thomas looked from one man to the other. Then who is the witness now? Whitlock met Elias's eyes. Neither of them spoke. Outside, fog rolled across Blackmere, swallowing the cliffs and the sea. The lighthouse beam turned slowly through the whiteness. Then the bell rang. Not one toll. Not 6. 20. Each strike echoed through the tower like a hammer on stone. Elias counted until his throat went dry. When the final toll faded, all 3 men remained frozen. Far below, from the chamber beneath the island, came the answering sound. 10 tolls. Half returned. Whitlock closed his eyes. A ship, he whispered. A large one. Before dawn, a messenger boat arrived from the mainland with devastating news. A passenger steamer carrying 20 people had struck hidden rocks in dense fog. 10 had been rescued. 10 were still missing. Elias stared at the dark sea beyond the window. For the first time, the number had arrived before the wreck occurred. The ledger was no longer merely recording the sea. It was speaking ahead of it. After the 20 tolls, Blackmere stopped feeling like a lighthouse station and began to feel like the center of a storm that had not yet arrived. News of the wreck spread quickly along the coast, and with it spread fear. Captains who once ignored Elias now sent messengers asking whether the bell had sounded again before they dared leave harbor. Some refused to sail at all. Elias answered none of them. He spent the morning in the lantern room, staring through the fog while Whitlock sorted papers below. The scholar's hands moved quickly, arranging dates, numbers, and ship names into neat columns. Thomas watched him uneasily. You're treating this like a puzzle, Thomas said. Whitlock did not look up. Because it is one. People are dying. Whitlock's expression tightened. And if we understand the ledger, perhaps fewer will. That afternoon, Elias descended into the underground chamber alone. The ancient bell hung motionless in the center of the room. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, rhythmic taps. He walked to the stone inscription and placed his hand against the cold surface. What are you? He whispered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a distant vibration traveled through the stone beneath his palm, faint but unmistakable, like the heartbeat of something sleeping deep below the island. Elias stepped back. When he returned upstairs, Whitlock was waiting with a new discovery. I've compared every entry in your journal with harbor records, he said. There is one event that does not fit. He pointed to a date, December 14th, 1871. 7 tolls had rung before the disappearance of a passenger vessel. 7 were reported lost, Elias said. No, Whitlock replied. 8 people were aboard. Thomas frowned. Then 1 survived? Whitlock slowly shook his head. 1 was never counted. He unfolded another document. It was a passenger list, water-stained and difficult to read. Near the bottom was the name Eleanor Reed. Elias looked up sharply. Reed? Whitlock nodded. A descendant of Nathaniel Reed. Thomas felt a chill. What happened to her? No one knows, Whitlock answered. Her body was never found, but neither was any evidence that she boarded the ship. It is as if she vanished before the wreck. Before anyone could speak again, the bell rang. 3 tolls. Sharp. Immediate. All 3 men froze. From below came a single answering toll. 3 taken. 1 returned. Thomas grabbed his coat. We have to warn the harbor. Elias hesitated only a moment before nodding. Thomas hurried down the cliff path toward the waiting supply boat. Whitlock remained behind. You know what troubles me, he said quietly. What? The answer below should have been 1.5. Elias stared at him. But the bell gave 1. Whitlock continued. The sea rounded down. What difference does that make? Whitlock looked toward the staircase. It means the ledger is choosing. By nightfall, Thomas returned with grim news. A small coastal cutter had overturned near the harbor mouth. 3 men had gone into the water. 1 had been rescued. The numbers matched perfectly, but another message arrived with it. The harbor master of Dunwall wanted Elias to come ashore immediately. Why? Elias asked. Thomas handed him the note. A woman has appeared claiming she survived the December wreck. She says the sea sent her back because the witness is not yet finished. Elias felt the room grow colder. What's her name? Whitlock asked. Thomas swallowed. Eleanor Reed. ###the crossing. The next morning the sea was unusually calm. Elias, Thomas, and Whitlock boarded the supply boat for Dunwall, leaving the lighthouse dark for the first time in months. As Blackmere receded behind them, Elias felt an irrational fear that the island was watching. Halfway across the channel, the boatman suddenly slowed. "Do you hear that?" he asked. At first there was only the creak of wood and the slap of water against the hull. Then, faintly beneath the waves, came a bell. One toll, then another. The boatman crossed himself. Thomas turned pale. Whitlock counted under his breath. 5 tolls. The sound faded. "We're not on the island," Thomas whispered. "The ledger travels with the witness," Whitlock replied. Elias said nothing, but his hands tightened around the rail. When they reached Dunwall, the harbor was crowded. Sailors and fishermen gathered outside the customs house, speaking in hushed voices. The moment Elias stepped ashore, the crowd parted. Inside, a young woman sat beside the fire wrapped in a gray blanket. Her dark hair was streaked with salt, and her eyes seemed older than the rest of her face. When she saw Elias, she stood. "You're the keeper," she said. "And you're Eleanor Reed." She nodded. Whitlock stepped forward. "The records say you vanished before the wreck." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "I did. Then how are you here?" Her answer was barely above a whisper. "Because the sea changed its mind." Outside, somewhere beyond the harbor and the fog, a bell began to ring. The sound rolled across the harbor like distant thunder. Every conversation outside the customs house stopped at once. Sailors turned toward the fog, searching the water for a ship that was not there. Elias stepped to the window. The bell was coming from the direction of Blackmere. One toll, then another, and another. 5 in total. Whitlock counted them silently. Eleanor closed her eyes as if she had expected the sound. "The same number we heard beneath the water," Thomas whispered. Elias turned to Eleanor. "Tell us what happened." She stared into the fire for several moments before speaking. "The ship never reached the reef," she said. "At least not when I left it." Whitlock frowned. "What do you mean?" "I was standing on the deck when the fog closed around us. Then I heard a bell beneath the hull. Everyone else kept talking as if they heard nothing." Her hands tightened around the blanket. The sea went completely still. No wind. No waves. The captain shouted for more speed, but the ship wouldn't move. Then the bell rang again, and I saw something in the water. "What?" Thomas asked. Eleanor looked up, and for the first time fear broke through her calm expression. "A tower." The room fell silent. "Not Blackmere," she continued. "Another tower, beneath the surface." Its light was shining through the water. Whitlock took a step closer. "How long did you see it?" "Only a moment. Then a wave struck the ship. I fell overboard." "And after that?" Elias asked. "I sank," she said softly. "I should have drowned. Instead I heard the bell a third time, and the water carried me away from the ship." Thomas shook his head. "That's impossible." "I know." Whitlock opened his notebook and flipped through several pages. Nathaniel Reed wrote of a light beneath the deep during the Great Gale of 1824. I thought it was a metaphor. Eleanor looked at him sharply. It wasn't. Before anyone could speak again, a harbor runner burst through the door. "A trawler's missing," he shouted. 5 men aboard. They left before dawn and never returned. The room went cold. 5 tolls. 5 men. Elias closed his eyes briefly. The ledger had spoken again. "Launch a search," the harbor master ordered from across the room. As men rushed outside, Eleanor caught Elias's arm. "You don't understand," she said urgently. "The bell isn't warning them anymore. It's calling them." Elias stared at her. "Calling them where?" Her answer was almost inaudible. "To the tower beneath the sea. ####, the missing trawler." By evening the search boats returned empty. No wreckage. No bodies. Not even a floating crate. Whitlock spread a chart of the coast across the table. "Where was the trawler last seen?" The harbor master pointed to a mark several miles east of Blackmere. Eleanor's face drained of color. "That's where I saw the light." Thomas looked at Elias. "We should go back to the island." Elias nodded. Whatever was happening had begun there. They left before midnight aboard a small cutter. The fog thickened as they crossed the channel, swallowing the harbor lights behind them. Halfway to Blackmere, the bell rang beneath the water. Not faintly this time. Loud enough to vibrate through the hull. The boatman nearly dropped the tiller. 1 toll. 2, 3, 4, 5. Then, from somewhere below the waves, came the answering sound. 2 tolls. Whitlock gripped the rail. 5 taken. 2 returned. At that exact moment, a shout came from the bow. There! A figure floated in the fog ahead of them. They pulled a fisherman from the water, barely conscious. Minutes later, they found a second survivor clinging to a broken oar. 2 returned. What happened? Elias demanded. The first fisherman coughed seawater and stared into the darkness behind them. We followed a light, he whispered. What light? A lighthouse. Thomas looked toward Blackmere. Its beam was still miles away. There was no lighthouse there, he said. The fisherman shook his head violently. There was. Under the water. Eleanor closed her eyes. The cutter reached Blackmere shortly after dawn. As soon as Elias stepped onto the island, the lighthouse bell above rang once. From deep below the cliffs, the ancient bell answered once. Whitlock looked from the tower to the sea. The ledger is complete, he said. But Elias felt something else. The island was not settling. It was waiting. As they climbed toward the lighthouse, Eleanor suddenly stopped. Her gaze was fixed on the eastern horizon. Far beyond the reef, where the fog touched the sea, a pale beam of light was shining upward from beneath the water. And slowly, impossibly, it was moving toward Blackmere. Part 7. The pale beam beneath the water moved with terrible slowness, gliding through the fog like a lantern carried by an unseen hand. No ship broke the surface around it. No mast, no sail, no smoke. Only the light, shining upward from somewhere below the Atlantic. Elias stopped halfway up the cliff path. The 2 rescued fishermen crossed themselves and refused to go any farther. One of them turned back toward the cutter without another word. Thomas stared at the horizon. Tell me I'm not seeing that. You're seeing it, Whitlock said. Eleanor had gone completely still. Her eyes followed the underwater glow as if she recognized it. It's closer than before, she whispered. Elias looked toward Blackmere's lighthouse. The beam from the tower swept across the fog every 30 seconds. Each time it passed over the sea, the pale light beneath the water seemed to brighten in answer. Inside, Elias said, All of you. They entered the keeper's quarters just as the wind began to rise. The island had been calm at dawn, but now a cold pressure settled over it, the kind that comes before a violent storm. Whitlock spread his papers across the table with shaking hands. There has to be a pattern, he muttered. The tolls, the survivors, the underwater light. Elias opened the journal of Nathaniel Reed again. Most of the pages had become familiar to him, but one loose sheet slipped from the back cover and drifted onto the floor. It was written in a different hand. Older. Whitlock picked it up carefully and read aloud. If the lower light approaches the island, the witness must not answer the final toll. Once the 2 lights stand together, the ledger closes, and the sea chooses a new keeper. Thomas looked from the paper to Elias. What does answer the final toll mean? Eleanor spoke before Whitlock could. It means someone has to ring the bell. The room fell silent. Elias felt a chill spread through him. The lighthouse bell has been ringing on its own. Until the last one, Eleanor said. The final toll is different. Whitlock turned the sheet over. On the back was a date, March 1824. This was written by someone before Nathaniel Reed, he said. Another witness. Outside, the bell rang. 1 toll, then another. 3, 4, 9 in total. The sound echoed through the tower. From below the island came 4 answering tolls. 9 taken. 4 returned. Whitlock grabbed the coastal chart. There's a mail packet due from Calder this morning. 9 aboard. Thomas ran to the window. Can we warn them? Elias looked toward the sea. The pale underwater light had moved closer still. No, he said quietly. It's already happened. ###the chamber beneath. That afternoon, Elias descended into the underground chamber with Whitlock and Eleanor. Thomas remained above to watch the sea. The ancient bell hung motionless, but the air around it felt charged, as if a storm were trapped inside the stone walls. Eleanor walked directly to the far side of the chamber. There's another inscription here, she said. Whitlock held up the lantern. Beneath a layer of mineral deposits was a carved circle containing 2 towers, one above the waves, one below. Between them was a line of text. When the drowned light rises, the witness stands between worlds. Elias touched the carving. The stone was warm. That shouldn't be possible. Whitlock whispered. Then the underground bell rang. Not a full toll. A faint vibration, like a breath passing through metal. Eleanor stepped back suddenly. It knows we're here. Whitlock looked at her sharply. How do you know these things? She hesitated. Because when I was in the water, I heard voices. Elias stared at her. What voices? Not words. More like memories. Men calling for help. Children crying. Prayers in languages I didn't recognize. She pressed a hand against her temple. Thousands of them. Whitlock's face had gone pale. The ledger isn't counting deaths, he said slowly. It's keeping every voice the sea has taken. The bell above suddenly rang through the stone ceiling. Once, twice, 3 times, then a fourth. The underground bell answered twice. For taken. 2 returned. But before the echo faded, a new sound rose from the depths below the chamber. Another bell. Lower. Farther away. Eleanor grabbed Elias's arm. There are more. The distant bell rang again. And again. Whitlock backed away from the edge of the chamber floor. This island isn't the source, he whispered. It's one station in a chain. Then the stone beneath them trembled. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the rising tide. They rushed back to the surface. Thomas met them at the lighthouse door, breathless. The sea's coming in too fast. Elias climbed to the lantern room. His heart tightened. The tide had risen several feet in less than an hour. Waves were striking rocks that should have been exposed until evening. And beyond the reef, the pale underwater light was now clearly visible through the fog. It was shaped like a beam from a lighthouse lantern. Whitlock stared through the glass. How far away? Less than a mile. Thomas whispered a prayer. The bell rang again. 12 tolls. The underground bell answered 6. Whitlock did not bother checking the charts this time. Another ship, he said. But Elias was no longer listening. As the 12th toll faded, a second underwater light appeared beside the first. Eleanor gasped. That wasn't there before. 2 beams now moved beneath the sea, advancing toward Blackmere in perfect silence. Whitlock opened the old sheet from 1824 again. His finger traced a line near the bottom that he had overlooked. The first light gathers the claimed. The second gathers the returned. When both arrive, the witness must choose which names remain. Elias turned toward him. What names? Whitlock looked up slowly. Everyone the sea has taken. A violent crash shook the tower. A wave had struck the cliff below. Thomas looked out the window and swore. Water was flooding the lower path. Another crash followed. Then another. The storm had arrived. But the sky above Blackmere remained strangely clear. The storm was coming from the sea itself. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the final ledger. As darkness fell, the 2 underwater lights reached the reef. For one impossible moment, the fog thinned. And all 4 of them saw it. A lighthouse beneath the Atlantic. Its stone tower rose from the darkness below the waves, distorted by the moving water, but unmistakable. Barnacles covered its sides. A lantern burned at its summit with a pale blue fire. Then the fog closed again. Thomas staggered backward. Dear God. Eleanor was crying silently. Whitlock gripped the window frame so hard his knuckles whitened. It's real. The bell above rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. 4. 5. 6. 7. 8. It continued past 10. Past 20. Past 30. Elias stopped counting. The underground bell answered with half as many tolls. Then the distant bells beneath the island joined in. Dozens of them. The sound rose through the stone like a chorus from the bottom of the sea. Whitlock looked at the old sheet one last time. At the very bottom, almost hidden by age, was a final sentence. When the drowned tower reaches the shore, the witness must speak the names of the returned, or the sea will keep them all. Elias turned toward Eleanor. You were returned, he said. She nodded. Thomas stared at him. What are you thinking? Elias closed the journal. I think the sea has been waiting for someone to answer it for more than 200 years. Outside, beyond the cliffs of Blackmere, the pale blue light of the drowned lighthouse rose higher through the waves, and the bells continued to ring. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag part 8. The bells did not stop. They rolled through Blackmere in overlapping waves of sound, some deep and mournful, others sharp and distant, as if countless towers hidden beneath the Atlantic had awakened together. The lighthouse above shook with every toll. Dust drifted from the ceiling beams, and the great lens in the lantern room trembled in its brass frame. Elias stood motionless beside the window, staring into the fog where the drowned lighthouse had appeared. The pale blue glow beneath the water was brighter now, close enough that he could see it pulsing through the waves. Whitlock unfolded the old sheet from 1824 once more. "Read it again," Elias said. The scholar swallowed and read aloud. "When the drowned tower reaches the shore, the witness must speak the names of the returned, or the sea will keep them all." Thomas shook his head. "What does that even mean?" Eleanor answered before Whitlock could. "The returned are the people the sea chose not to keep." "Then why would speaking their names matter?" Thomas asked. Eleanor looked toward the water. "Because the sea forgets." Another crash thundered against the cliffs. A wave surged high enough to strike the lower windows of the lighthouse. Elias turned from the sea. "If the witness must speak the names, then we need a list." Whitlock spread the journals across the table. Together they began searching through every recorded toll. The two fishermen from the Dunwall fleet, the survivors of the passenger steamer, the rescued sailors, the fishermen from Calder, the men pulled from the trawler, every soul the underground bell had counted as returned. The list grew longer than any of them expected. 23 names. Elias wrote each one carefully on a fresh sheet of paper. As he finished the last name, the bells abruptly ceased. The silence was worse. ####, the voice in the fog. For several seconds, only the wind remained. Then a voice drifted across the water. Not from the lighthouse. Not from the island. From the fog beyond the reef. "Elias." Thomas spun toward the door. "Did you hear that?" Elias felt his blood run cold. He knew the voice. It belonged to his wife, Miriam, who had died 7 years earlier. "Elias." The voice came again, softer this time. Eleanor closed her eyes. "Don't answer it." Whitlock stared at Elias. "Who is that?" "My wife." Thomas whispered. "That's impossible." Outside, the fog shifted. For a heartbeat, Elias thought he saw a woman standing at the edge of the cliff path, her dress moving in the wind. He took a step toward the door. Eleanor seized his arm. "If you answer the wrong voice, the ledger closes." The figure vanished. The bells below the island rang once. Then silence returned. ###, the keeper's choice. Near midnight, the sea reached the base of the lighthouse. No storm should have produced such a tide. Water flooded the lower path and poured into cracks in the rock. The entire island seemed to groan. Whitlock looked out through the lantern room glass and went pale. "It's here." The drowned lighthouse had reached the shore. Though most of its tower remained beneath the waves, the pale lantern burned only a few hundred yards from Blackmere. Through the shifting water, they could make out ancient stone, broken windows, and chains hanging from the submerged walls. Elias took the list of names. "Where do I speak them?" Eleanor pointed downward. "In the chamber." They descended the spiral staircase while the sea pounded against the cliffs. The tunnel entrance was already filling with cold seawater. The underground chamber glowed faintly blue. The ancient bell swung gently on its own. Elias stepped to the center of the room. Whitlock held the lantern. Thomas stood near the tunnel entrance, watching the rising water. Eleanor faced the bell with tears in her eyes. "Begin," she said. Elias read the first name. The bell rang once. He read the second. Another toll. With each name, the bell answered. The sound was no longer mournful. It was changing, becoming lighter, almost clear. By the 10th name, the water in the chamber had stopped rising. By the 15th, the blue glow began to fade. By the 20th, the distant bells beneath the island had fallen silent. Elias read the 23rd and final name. The ancient bell rang one last time. Then it cracked. A jagged line split the bronze from top to bottom. The chamber went dark. ###, the witness. For a moment, none of them moved. Then the tunnel trembled. Whitlock raised the lantern just as a section of the far wall collapsed inward. Behind it was another chamber, sealed for centuries. In the center lay a skeleton dressed in the remains of a lighthouse keeper's coat. Beside it rested a rusted brass key. Thomas stared. Nathaniel Reed? Whitlock knelt carefully. The coat was older than Reed's time. "No," he said. "Someone before him." On the wall above the skeleton was a final inscription. "The witness keeps the names until another remembers them." Elias looked down at the list in his hand. The ink was disappearing. One by one, The names faded from the paper until only blank parchment remained. Eleanor exhaled shakily. They've been released. Released from what? Thomas asked. Eleanor looked toward the sea beyond the tunnel. From being forgotten. Hashtag the last hole. They climbed back to the surface. The tide was falling. The fog had begun to thin. Elias reached the lantern room first. The drowned lighthouse was gone. Only dark water remained beyond the reef. Whitlock let out a long breath. It's over. As if in answer, the lighthouse bell above them rang once. Not by itself. The rope moved. All four of them stared. A hand was pulling it. Elias rushed down the stairs and threw open the door. The cliff path was empty. The rope swung gently in the wind. Beside it lay a small object wrapped in wet cloth. Elias picked it up. Inside was a brass nameplate, polished despite its age. Nathaniel Reed. On the back, freshly engraved, were 3 words. The ledger remembers. Elias looked toward the sea. The Atlantic was calm. For the first time in months, no bells answered from below. Whitlock left Blackmere 2 days later, carrying copies of every inscription and journal page. Thomas returned to the harbor, though he never again sailed east of the island after dark. Eleanor vanished before dawn on the 3rd morning, leaving no note and no trace except a single wet footprint beside the tunnel entrance. Elias remained. He continued tending the lighthouse through the spring and summer. The bell did not ring. The underground chamber stayed silent. The sea behaved like an ordinary sea. Then, on the first night of winter, nearly a year later, Elias climbed the spiral staircase to light the lamp. As he reached the lantern room, he heard a faint sound rising from far below the cliffs. Not one bell, many, and somewhere beyond the darkness of the Atlantic, another light answered. The first winter after the drowned lighthouse vanished was colder than any Elias could remember. Ice formed along the outer railings of the tower, and the Atlantic struck the cliffs with the heavy rhythm of a giant heartbeat. For months the sea had been ordinary. No mysterious tolls, no underwater light, no voices in the fog. Then, on the first night of December 1872, the distant bells returned. Elias stood in the lantern room, listening to them drift across the water. They were not as loud as before, but there were more of them. Some sounded close, others impossibly far away, as if carried from beneath different parts of the ocean. He did not write in the journal immediately. Instead, he climbed down to the keeper's quarters and lit the stove. The silence inside felt fragile, waiting to break. At dawn, a boat appeared through the fog. Thomas Vale stepped ashore carrying a bundle of supplies and a worried expression. "You heard them too," he said before Elias could speak. Elias nodded. Thomas set the bundle down. The harbor heard them all night. Men came out of their houses thinking a ship was wrecking offshore. No wreck. None. Elias poured coffee into 2 tin cups. Then the bells aren't counting. Thomas looked toward the sea. Or they're counting something we can't see. Whitlock's letter. Among the supplies was a letter from Edinburgh. Elias recognized Whitlock's handwriting immediately. "Elias, the papers I brought from Blackmere have led me to records I never expected to find. The drowned lighthouse is not unique. Along the coasts of Scotland, Norway, Iceland, and even Newfoundland, there are references to towers that appear beneath the sea during periods of great loss. The oldest account I have found dates to 1439. A monk described bells rising from the deep before the winter plague. Another record from 1588 speaks of a blue light beneath the Atlantic after a fleet vanished in a storm. I believe Blackmere is one of several places where the ledger surfaces. The witnesses did not create it. They merely kept its memory alive. There is one detail that troubles me. In every account, the bells returned exactly 1 year after the ledger was closed. Whitlock. Thomas read the letter twice. "What happens after a year?" he asked. Elias folded the paper carefully. "I don't think Whitlock knows." The boy on the shore. That evening, while Thomas repaired a lantern wick, Elias noticed movement near the base of the cliff. A boy stood on the rocks. He could not have been more than 10 years old. His clothes were soaked, and he stared up at the lighthouse without moving. Elias hurried down the path. "Where did you come from?" he called. The boy did not answer. When Elias reached the shore, he saw that the child's bare feet left no marks on the wet stones. "Are you hurt?" The boy finally looked at him. His eyes were the color of deep sea water. The names are fading again, he said. Elias felt the cold climb his spine. What names? The ones you returned. Before Elias could move, a wave surged between them. When it fell back, the boy was gone. Only a small object remained on the rock. A brass button from a lighthouse keeper's coat. The forgotten chamber. That night Elias and Thomas descended into the underground chamber for the first time since the bell had cracked. The broken bronze still hung in two pieces. Salt crystals coated the split metal. But something had changed. The wall that had collapsed months earlier now revealed a narrow passage leading deeper into the island. Thomas raised the lantern. That wasn't there before. Elias nodded slowly. They followed the passage downward. The air grew warmer instead of colder, carrying a faint metallic smell. After several minutes, the tunnel opened into a second chamber. Rows of stone tablets filled the room. Hundreds of them. Each tablet bore names. Whitlock would have called it an archive. Elias knew a better word. A ledger. Thomas ran his lantern across the nearest tablet. These are dates, he whispered. 1439. 1588. 1672. 1824. Every year Whitlock had mentioned. At the center of the chamber stood an empty pedestal. On its surface was carved a single sentence. The witness writes what the sea cannot keep. Elias stared at the empty space. There's supposed to be a tablet here. Thomas pointed to fresh scratches in the stone. Something had been removed recently. Then they heard footsteps. Not their own. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the darkness beyond the chamber. The other witness. A lantern appeared first. Then a man stepped into the light. He was elderly, with a weather-beaten face and a heavy wool coat darkened by salt. Around his neck hung a brass key nearly identical to the one found beside the ancient skeleton. Thomas backed away. The stranger studied Elias for a long moment. "You're the Blackmere witness," he said. His accent was not local. Norwegian, perhaps. "Who are you?" Elias asked. "Henrik Svensson, keeper of the lighthouse at Skarvik." "Another witness," Elias said. Henrik nodded. "I followed the bells here." He stepped closer to the empty pedestal. "Your tablet is missing." "My what?" "The record of the names you returned." Thomas frowned. "Why would someone take it?" Henrik's expression hardened. "Because there are those who believe the sea should not give names back." The Order of the Deep. Henrik told them a story unlike anything Whitlock had discovered. Centuries earlier, after a series of devastating storms, a group of mariners and priests formed a secret order. They believed the drowned voices beneath the sea were dangerous. Whenever a witness returned names to the living, memories of the dead lingered, drawing the drowned lighthouse back toward shore. They called themselves the Order of the Deep, Henrik said. Their purpose was simple: let the sea keep what it takes. Elias looked at the empty pedestal, and they took the tablet. If the names fade completely, the ledger reopens. Thomas swallowed. What happens then? Henrik met his eyes. Everything the sea returned can be reclaimed. A distant bell rang through the tunnels. One toll, then another. Not from above, from deeper within the island. The reclaimed. They followed the sound through a twisting corridor until it emerged onto a hidden cavern facing the ocean. Black water surged below, and standing on the rocks at the edge of the cavern was Eleanor Reed. Her gray blanket hung wet against her shoulders. Her eyes reflected the blue glow rising from the sea outside. "You shouldn't have come back," she said to Elias. "What's happening?" Eleanor looked toward the water. "The names are being erased." Henrik stepped forward. "Who took the tablet?" Eleanor did not answer. Instead, she pointed out to sea. Beyond the cavern mouth, far beneath the waves, a pale light was moving toward Blackmere once more. Then a second light appeared beside it. And a third. Thomas stared in horror. There were only two before. Eleanor's voice trembled. "The sea is coming for what was returned." The missing names. Back in the ledger chamber, Henrik examined the pedestal closely. "The tablet was removed within the last few days," he said. "Who else knows about this place?" Elias thought of Whitlock, Thomas, and Eleanor. Then he remembered the boy on the shore. "A child came to the island," he said slowly. He said the names were fading. Henrik's face changed. "Describe him." Elias did. When he finished, Henrik made the sign of the cross. "That was no child," he said. "Then what was it?" Thomas asked. Henrik looked toward the dark passage behind them. "The first witness. A cold silence settled over the chamber. Henrik explained that the oldest record spoke of a keeper who drowned during a great storm centuries before Blackmere's lighthouse existed. When the ledger first opened, he became bound to it. Since then, he appeared whenever the names began to disappear. He cannot restore them himself, Henrik said. Only the living witness can. Elias looked at the empty pedestal. Then I need to find the tablet. Before the third light reaches shore, Henrik replied. From somewhere beyond the cliffs, the bells began ringing again. And this time, they were counting upward. The bells climbed through the darkness one toll at a time. 1, 2, 3. Each strike echoed through the tunnels beneath Blackmere, vibrating in the stone floor. Elias felt the sound in his chest like a second heartbeat. Henrik listened with his eyes closed. It's not counting the taken, he said. Then what is it counting? Thomas asked. Henrik opened his eyes. The names that remain. Another toll rang out. 4. Elias looked at the empty pedestal. There were 23 names. And if the count reaches 0, Henrik said quietly, the sea will reclaim every soul that was returned. ####the first witness. They climbed back toward the surface. The cavern mouth glowed with pale blue light from the sea beyond. Eleanor stood waiting beside the tunnel entrance. The first witness is on the island, she said. Thomas glanced nervously into the fog. Can you see him? No, she replied. But I can hear him. The bells sounded again. 5, 6. Elias hurried toward the lighthouse. Rain had begun to fall, thin and icy. The beam from the tower swept across the sea, revealing 3 underwater lights moving steadily toward Blackmere. As he reached the door, a figure stepped out of the fog. The boy from the shore. His clothes were no longer dripping wet. Instead, they looked faded, as if woven from mist and salt. Thomas froze. Henrik lowered his head in silent recognition. The boy looked directly at Elias. There are 17 left, he said. Elias realized the count had continued while they climbed. Who took the tablet? The boy pointed toward the lighthouse. The one who fears remembrance. Then he faded into the rain. Not vanished suddenly. Simply became less and less solid until only the falling water remained. #### the hidden door. Elias rushed inside. The lighthouse seemed different somehow. The air carried the faint smell of wet earth, and one of the bookshelves in the keeper's quarters stood slightly away from the wall. Thomas noticed it first. Was that always there? Elias shook his head. Behind the shelf they found a narrow wooden door. The brass key discovered beside the ancient skeleton fit the lock perfectly. Inside was a cramped room lit by a single oil lamp. And seated at the small desk was Dr. Samuel Whitlock. For a moment no one spoke. Then Thomas said, "You took the tablet." Whitlock did not deny it. On the desk lay a stone slab covered in names. The missing tablet. Why? Elias demanded. Whitlock looked exhausted, older than when he had left Blackmere months earlier. Because I read the rest of the records, he said. The ones I never showed you. Henrik stepped forward. The Order of the Deep. Whitlock nodded. I found their archives in Edinburgh. They were not trying to destroy the returned names. They were trying to protect the living from what happens when the drowned remember too much. Elias stared at him. People will die if those names vanish. People will die either way, Whitlock replied. The bells rang again. 16. Whitlock closed his eyes briefly. You don't understand what's coming. #### the fourth light. Whitlock carried the tablet into the lantern room. Outside, the sea had become a field of moving blue fire. 3 underwater lights approached from the east. Then a fourth appeared from the north. Henrik swore under his breath. For drowned towers, he said. I've never heard of more than 2. Eleanor looked out through the glass. They're converging on Blackmere. Whitlock set the tablet on the floor. The Order believed that every returned name leaves a path between the living and the drowned. One path is harmless. 23. He shook his head. 23 is a beacon. Elias remembered the voices Eleanor had heard beneath the water. The sea wants them back. Not the sea, Whitlock said. The dead. Another toll. 15. As the number fell, the blue lights grew brighter. #### the ledger opens. The lighthouse shook violently. A wave struck the cliffs with enough force to crack a window in the lower stairwell. Water sprayed into the tower. Henrik grabbed the tablet. We have to return it to the pedestal now. Whitlock blocked his path. If you do that, the drowned towers will reach shore. And if we don't, Elias said, the names disappear. Whitlock looked at him with genuine sorrow. Elias, listen to me. When the ledger closes completely, the witness becomes part of it. The room went silent. Thomas stared. You mean he dies? Whitlock shook his head slowly. I mean he is remembered by the sea. Elias thought of the boy on the shore. The first witness. That's what happened to him. Whitlock nodded. Another toll. 14. Elias looked from the tablet to the sea. If I refuse to return the names, 23 people are reclaimed. Yes. And if I return them? Whitlock's voice was barely audible. You become the next keeper of the ledger. #### the descent. Elias picked up the tablet. It was heavier than stone should have been, as if the names carved into it carried their own weight. I'm going below, he said. Thomas grabbed his arm. There has to be another way. If there is, we don't have time to find it. The bells rang. 13. Eleanor stepped beside him. I'll come with you. Henrik took a lantern. So will I. Whitlock remained in the lantern room, staring out at the advancing lights. As Elias reached the stairwell, Whitlock called after him. When the final toll sounds, do not look into the water. Elias paused. Why? Whitlock did not answer. #### the chamber of names. They descended through the flooded tunnel. Water swirled around their boots. The deeper they went, the louder the bells became. 12. 11. In the ledger chamber, the empty pedestal waited beneath the flickering lantern light. Elias placed the tablet upon it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then every carved name began to glow. The blue light spread through the chamber walls, racing along cracks in the stone. Far below, dozens of hidden bells answered at once. Eleanor gasped. The ledger is opening. Henrik stepped back as the floor trembled. 10. 9. The glow intensified until the chamber was brighter than daylight. Shadows moved across the walls, not cast by the lantern, but by unseen figures. Voices rose from the stone. Hundreds of them. Names. Prayers. Cries for help. Elias recognized none of the languages, yet somehow understood the desperation in all of them. Then the voices became clear. Elias. Keeper. Remember us. The bells continued. 8. 7. The sea beyond the chamber roared like an approaching avalanche. And somewhere above them, for drowned lighthouses were coming ashore. The bells climbed through the darkness one toll at a time. 1, 2, 3. Each strike echoed through the tunnels beneath Blackmere, vibrating in the stone floor. Elias felt the sound in his chest like a second heartbeat. Henrik listened with his eyes closed. It's not counting the taken, he said. Then what is it counting? Thomas asked. Henrik opened his eyes. The names that remain. Another toll rang out. 4. Elias looked at the empty pedestal. There were 23 names. And if the count reaches 0, Henrik said quietly, the sea will reclaim every soul that was returned. #### the first witness. They climbed back toward the surface. The cavern mouth glowed with pale blue light from the sea beyond. Eleanor stood waiting beside the tunnel entrance. The first witness is on the island, she said. Thomas glanced nervously into the fog. Can you see him? No, she replied. But I can hear him. The bells sounded again. 5. 6. Elias hurried toward the lighthouse. Rain had begun to fall, thin and icy. The beam from the tower swept across the sea, revealing 3 underwater lights moving steadily toward Blackmere. As he reached the door, a figure stepped out of the fog. The boy from the shore. His clothes were no longer dripping wet. Instead, they looked faded, as if woven from mist and salt. Thomas froze. Henrik lowered his head in silent recognition. The boy looked directly at Elias. There are 17 left, he said. Elias realized the count had continued while they climbed. Who took the tablet? The boy pointed toward the lighthouse. The one who fears remembrance. Then he faded into the rain. Not vanished suddenly. Simply became less and less solid until only the falling water remained. #### the hidden door. Elias rushed inside. The lighthouse seemed different somehow. The air carried the faint smell of wet earth, and one of the bookshelves in the keeper's quarters stood slightly away from the wall. Thomas noticed it first. Was that always there? Elias shook his head. Behind the shelf, they found a narrow wooden door. The brass key discovered beside the ancient skeleton fit the lock perfectly. Inside was a cramped room lit by a single oil lamp. And seated at the small desk was Dr. Samuel Whitlock. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Thomas said, "You took the tablet." Whitlock did not deny it. On the desk lay a stone slab covered in names. The missing tablet. Why? Elias demanded. Whitlock looked exhausted, older than when he had left Blackmere months earlier. "Because I read the rest of the records," he said. "The ones I never showed you." Henrik stepped forward. "The Order of the Deep." Whitlock nodded. "I found their archives in Edinburgh. They were not trying to destroy the return names. They were trying to protect the living from what happens when the drowned remember too much." Elias stared at him. "People will die if those names vanish." "People will die either way," Whitlock replied. The bells rang again. 16. Whitlock closed his eyes briefly. "You don't understand what's coming. ##### the fourth light." Whitlock carried the tablet into the lantern room. Outside, the sea had become a field of moving blue fire. 3 underwater lights approached from the east. Then a fourth appeared from the north. Henrik swore under his breath. "For drowned towers," he said. "I've never heard of more than 2. Eleanor looked out through the glass. "They're converging on Blackmere." Whitlock set the tablet on the floor. The Order believed that every return name leaves a path between the living and the drowned. One path is harmless. 23. He shook his head. 23 is a beacon. Elias remembered the voices Eleanor had heard beneath the water. "The sea wants them back." "Not the sea," Whitlock said. "The dead." Another toll. 15. As the number fell, the blue lights grew brighter. ##### the ledger opens. The lighthouse shook violently. A wave struck the cliffs with enough force to crack a window in the lower stairwell. Water sprayed into the tower. Henrik grabbed the tablet. "We have to return it to the pedestal now." Whitlock blocked his path. "If you do that, the drowned towers will reach shore. And if we don't," Elias said, "the names disappear." Whitlock looked at him with genuine sorrow. "Elias, listen to me. When the ledger closes completely, the witness becomes part of it." The room went silent. Thomas stared. "You mean he dies?" Whitlock shook his head slowly. "I mean he is remembered by the sea." Elias thought of the boy on the shore. The first witness. That's what happened to him. Whitlock nodded. Another toll. 14. Elias looked from the tablet to the sea. "If I refuse to return the names, 23 people are reclaimed." "Yes." "And if I return them?" Whitlock's voice was barely audible. "You become the next keeper of the ledger." #### the descent. Elias picked up the tablet. It was heavier than stone should have been, as if the names carved into it carried their own weight. "I'm going below," he said. Thomas grabbed his arm. "There has to be another way. If there is, we don't have time to find it." The bells rang. 13. Eleanor stepped beside him. "I'll come with you." Henrik took a lantern. "So will I." Whitlock remained in the lantern room, staring out at the advancing lights. As Elias reached the stairwell, Whitlock called after him. "When the final toll sounds, do not look into the water." Elias paused. "Why?" Whitlock did not answer. #### the chamber of names. They descended through the flooded tunnel. Water swirled around their boots. The deeper they went, the louder the bells became. 12. 11. In the ledger chamber, the empty pedestal waited beneath the flickering lantern light. Elias placed the tablet upon it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then every carved name began to glow. The blue light spread through the chamber walls, racing along cracks in the stone. Far below, dozens of hidden bells answered at once. Eleanor gasped. "The ledger is opening." Henrik stepped back as the floor trembled. 10. 9. The glow intensified until the chamber was brighter than daylight. Shadows moved across the walls, not cast by the lantern, but by unseen figures. Voices rose from the stone. Hundreds of them. Names. Prayers. Cries for help. Elias recognized none of the languages, yet somehow understood the desperation in all of them. Then the voices became clear. "Elias. Keeper. Remember us." The bells continued. 8. 7. The sea beyond the chamber roared like an approaching avalanche. And somewhere above them, for drowned lighthouses were coming ashore. The ledger chamber blazed with blue light so intense that the lantern in Henrik's hand became invisible. Every carved name on the tablet glowed like molten silver. The voices rising from the stone no longer sounded distant. They surrounded Elias from every direction. "Remember us. Do not let the water close." "Keeper," Henrik backed toward the tunnel. "The drowned towers have reached the reef," he shouted over the roar echoing through the chamber. "We have to finish this before they enter the harbor." Elias looked at the glowing tablet. The bells above continued their relentless count. 6. Eleanor stepped beside him. "When the count reaches 0, the ledger will choose." "Choose what?" She met his eyes. "Whether the names remain with the living or return to the sea." Another tremor shook the chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling. From somewhere far above came the crash of a massive wave striking Blackmere's cliffs. 5. ##### the drowned towers. In the lantern room, Whitlock watched the impossible unfold. The fog had torn open. Beyond the reef, for submerged lighthouses moved through the water in a great circle around Blackmere. Their pale blue lanterns shone upward through the waves, illuminating ancient stone walls covered in barnacles and chains. They did not float like ships. They glided like things being pulled from the ocean floor. Whitlock gripped the cracked window frame. For years he had searched for proof that the legends were real. Now he wished he had never found it. The nearest drowned tower turned slightly, and through a broken window beneath the water, Whitlock saw faces. Not living faces. Pale shapes watching from the darkness inside the submerged tower. The bell above the lighthouse rang again. 4. #### the first name. Back in the chamber, the voices suddenly fell silent. Elias felt the change immediately. The blue light dimmed around the edges of the room, concentrating on the tablet. One name burned brighter than the others. Eleanor Reed. Eleanor stared at it in horror. "Why is my name there?" Henrik's face hardened. "Because the sea never fully released you." Elias looked from the glowing letters to Eleanor. "You were returned." "Part of me was," she whispered. The bell rang. 3. The name on the tablet began to fade. Eleanor staggered backward as if struck. "Elias." Her voice had become distant. Without thinking, he placed his hand over her name. The fading stopped, but a new line of blue light raced from the tablet into his palm. Elias gasped as memories flooded through him. Storms he had never seen. Ships breaking apart. Hands reaching through black water. A monk kneeling beside a bell in 1439. A Norwegian keeper staring at a drowned tower beneath the northern sea. Nathaniel Reed riding by candlelight while the Atlantic screamed outside his windows. And a boy standing alone on a cliff centuries before Blackmere's lighthouse existed. The first witness. When the visions released him, Elias was on his knees. 2. #### the truth of the witnesses. Henrik helped him up. "Now you know," he said quietly. Elias stared at his glowing hand. "The witnesses don't guard the ledger." Henrik nodded. "The ledger guards the witnesses." Eleanor looked at him through tears. "Every witness carries the names until another accepts them." Another tremor shook the chamber. Water surged through the tunnel entrance. Above them, the bells rang together. 1. The final toll. #### the choice. The tablet blazed white. Every name upon it began to disappear at once. Elias heard Whitlock's warning echo in his memory. When the final toll sounds, do not look into the water. Too late. The chamber floor had become a mirror of black sea water. And within it, Elias saw the drowned lighthouse. Not from a distance. From inside. Corridors flooded with cold blue light. Bells hanging from stone arches. Thousands of names carved into walls that stretched farther than sight. At the center stood the first witness. The boy raised a hand. Behind him, countless pale figures watched in silence. Then Elias saw something else. A fifth pedestal. Empty. Waiting. The first witness spoke, and this time the words were clear. "Choose." The water around the vision began to rise. Elias understood then. If he released the names, the returned souls would be reclaimed by the sea. If he held them, the ledger would pass into him completely. He looked at Eleanor. Her outline had become translucent. Then he looked at the glowing names fading from the tablet. 23 lives. 23 memories. 23 people who had been given back. Elias placed both hands on the stone. "I remember them," he said. The passing of the ledger. The chamber exploded with light. The voices of the drowned rose in a single, overwhelming cry, not of anguish, but of recognition. The fading names reignited, burning brighter than before. Eleanor's form became solid again. Outside, the roar of the sea reached a deafening peak. Then everything stopped. The water in the tunnel fell away. The bells ceased. The blue glow vanished from the chamber. Elias collapsed to one knee. Henrik caught his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" Elias looked up slowly. The world seemed sharper somehow. He could hear the waves striking the far side of the island, the creak of the lighthouse above, even the faint drip of water deep within the tunnels. And beneath all of it, he could hear names, not spoken aloud, remembered. The fifth tower. They climbed to the lantern room. Whitlock stood frozen at the window. "Look," he whispered. The four drowned lighthouses were retreating from Blackmere. Their blue lights faded as they moved back into the Atlantic depths. Relief flooded Thomas's face. "It's over." But Whitlock was still staring at the sea. Elias stepped beside him. Far beyond the reef, where the drowned towers were disappearing, a new light had appeared. Not beneath the water, above it. A lighthouse beam shining from the surface of the sea itself. Henrik inhaled sharply. "The fifth tower," he said. Thomas frowned. There was never a fifth. Henrik looked at Elias. "There is now. The new witness." Dawn came slowly. The sea was calm again. The mysterious surface light had vanished with the night. Whitlock gathered his papers in silence. At the door, he paused. "I spent my life trying to prove these stories," he said. "Now I understand why the witnesses hid them." Elias said nothing. Whitlock looked at him one last time. "Can you still hear them?" Elias hesitated. Then he nodded. Whitlock lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry." He left on the first supply boat and never returned. Henrik remained only long enough to repair the cracked bell in the underground chamber. Before departing, he handed Elias the brass key. "You'll need it," he said. "For what?" Henrik looked toward the eastern horizon. "When another witness comes." Years later, sailors would tell strange stories about Blackmere. They spoke of a lighthouse whose beams sometimes shone blue during winter storms. They spoke of bells heard beneath the water on moonless nights. And a few claimed that, far out at sea, they had seen a second lighthouse traveling silently across the waves before vanishing into the fog. Elias Granger remained keeper of Blackmere until the day he disappeared. No body was ever found. In the lantern room, his journal lay open to a final entry written in a steady hand. "The sea remembers more than the living can bear. I hear the names each night now, and I know another storm is coming. When the bells ring for the next witness, may they choose as I did." Beneath the entry was one final line, added in different ink many years later. The bells rang again in the winter of 1903. And somewhere in the North Atlantic, beyond the reach of charts and lanterns, a pale blue light still moves beneath the waves, counting the names the sea has not forgotten. The last keeper of Blackmere. For more than 30 years after Elias Granger vanished, Blackmere's lighthouse continued to shine. Supply boats found the lamp lit every night. The logbook was updated in neat handwriting. Fresh coal appeared beside the stove. Yet no one could say with certainty who lived in the tower. Some captains claimed they had seen a tall figure carrying a lantern along the cliff path during storms. Others swore the lighthouse was empty when they delivered supplies. The journal remained on the keeper's desk, growing thicker year by year. Then came the winter of 1903, the storm of 1903. On December 11th, a young harbor clerk named Daniel Mercer arrived at Blackmere with a shipment of lamp oil. He expected to meet an elderly keeper. Instead, he found the lighthouse silent. The lamp still burned above, but the rooms below were empty. On the desk lay Elias's journal, open to its final page. As Daniel read the last entry, the bell rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5. Daniel rushed outside. The rope beside the entrance swung by itself. Far below the cliffs, another bell answered. 2 tolls. He remembered the stories sailors told in taverns. The sea takes 5, returns 2. Before he could decide whether to flee, a voice came from behind him. "You should not be here tonight." Daniel turned. An old man stood at the doorway carrying a brass lantern. His coat was faded, and salt streaked his boots. "Are you the keeper?" Daniel asked. The old man looked toward the sea. "For a little longer." Then he handed Daniel the journal. When the bells stop, take this to the mainland. What is happening? The old man's eyes were the color of deep Atlantic water. The ledger is changing hands. The return of the drowned light. Night fell quickly. The storm arrived from the east, carrying fog so thick that the world beyond the cliffs disappeared. Then the sea began to glow. One blue light rose beneath the water. Then another. Then a third. Daniel stared in terror as the drowned lighthouses returned. The old keeper climbed the spiral staircase without hurry. Come, he said. Daniel followed him to the lantern room. The great lens turned slowly, casting its beam across the storm. Below, the underwater lights circled Blackmere exactly as they had decades earlier. Who are you? Daniel whispered. The old man rested a hand on the window frame. I was called Elias Granger. Daniel's breath caught. The man had not aged as much as he should have. His face was lined, but his eyes held a strange clarity, as if he had spent years looking at things no ordinary person could see. You disappeared, Daniel said. Elias nodded. The witness never truly leaves. The final lesson. The bells began again, not counting downward this time, counting upward. 1, 2, 3. Daniel clutched the journal. What do they mean? New names, Elias replied. People who will die. Elias looked at him sadly. People the sea will remember. As the count reached 7, a pale figure appeared in the fog outside the lantern room. A boy with seawater-colored eyes. The first witness. Daniel stumbled backward. The boy raised a hand toward Elias. It is time, he said. The passing. Elias turned to Daniel. Listen carefully. The ledger chooses someone who hears the bells and remembers the names. Tonight, that is you. Daniel shook his head. No, I said the same thing once. The bells reached 10. Below the island, the answering bells rang 5 times. Elias placed the brass key in Daniel's hand. The chamber beneath Blackmere will open for you when the time comes. Guard the names. Do not let them be forgotten. I don't understand any of this. Elias smiled faintly. You will. Then he stepped toward the cracked window. The fog outside parted. Beyond it stood a 5th lighthouse, shining from the surface of the sea. The beam from Blackmere met the blue light of the drowned tower. For one impossible moment, the 2 lights became one. Elias looked back at Daniel. Tell them the sea remembers. And he walked into the fog. The last entry. When the storm ended, the drowned lights were gone. So was Elias Granger. Daniel searched the island until dawn. He found only wet footprints leading to the cliff edge and vanishing there. Inside the lighthouse, the journal lay open. A new entry had appeared in fresh ink. December 11th, 1903. The ledger has passed. The bells have chosen another witness. I go now where the drowned keep their lights. Beneath it, in a different hand that Daniel did not remember writing, were 6 words. I hear the names already. Years later, sailors still spoke of Blackmere. On winter nights, they claimed a young keeper could be seen tending the lamp while distant bells echoed beneath the Atlantic. Some said the old keeper still walked the cliffs during storms. Others swore they had seen 2 figures in the fog, a man carrying a lantern and a boy with eyes like seawater. And whenever a ship was lost beyond the reef, fishermen listened carefully, because if the wind was right and the sea was dark enough, they could hear a bell ringing from somewhere beneath the waves. One toll for the taken, another for the returned, and a final toll for the keeper who remembered them all.